Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul Jannetto, Professor and Vice Chair of Clinical Practice at the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic. Paul is also a Laboratory Director of Clinical and Forensic Toxicology, Clinical Mass Spectrometry, and the Metals Lab. And if that's not enough, Paul is also the President-elect for the Association for Diagnostics and Laboratory Medicine. Paul, thank you for taking the time and thank you for joining us today.
Joe, thanks for the opportunity. It is my pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you. And for the theme we've decided for this discussion is collaboration. And in looking at some of the work that you've done, one that captured attention globally, and I was also intrigued when I saw it, was the work that you've done on measuring Beethoven's locks of hair. Yes, that is Beethoven himself, the legend, lock of hair. Can you talk a little bit about what you found when you've measured that and how that collaboration came to be?
Absolutely. Like all good things in life, we can never fully take credit for ourselves, right? It's really about teamwork and working collaboratively with others. And the Beethoven story is no other than just that. In this case, I had the opportunity that Kevin Brown, who is a philanthropist and actually was an owner of 2 authenticated locks of Beethoven hair, was looking to have these tested. Because there had been historical reports that maybe some of Beethoven's ailments, health conditions, had been potentially caused by heavy metals. And so basically Kevin Brown, Dr. William Meredith, who is a Beethoven scholar here in the United States, they reached out to Dr. Nader Rafai, who happened to know that Mayo Clinic has one of the world's leading laboratories for metals or elemental testing. And so Nader called me up and said, Paul, would you be able to test hair for heavy metals? And I'm like, absolutely. That's a standard routine clinical test for me, fully validated. Absolutely. And I was like, so whose hair? And he's like, Beethoven's hair. And unfortunately, I was thinking like Beethoven the dog, like the Disney dog. And he's like, no, the famous composer. And so who could pass such a historical opportunity? And I knew no other laboratory that would love this opportunity to do that testing. And so through this collaboration, our lab did receive 2 authenticated locks of hair, of which we then ultimately tested. And we did show that they contained very concentrated elements of lead in particular. And there was also a little bit of arsenic and mercury. But we got to remember back then, historically in that period, that some of that could have came from dietary sources and seafood and things. But the lead was exceptionally high. And that really stood out because, as you know, Beethoven had a number of known health ailments, including deafness. And those are some of the things that are well documented that can be caused by lead. So here we actually had authenticated locks, true proof that these concentrations were well above average, even considering for that time period where lead acetate was used in everything from to make cheap wine taste a little bit better, sweeter, as well as obviously medicinal practices and things like that. And so there's lots of potential sources of exposure, but we were able to actually document and show it in his hair.
And it's awesome. That study was published last year in Clinical Chemistry, so I'd encourage people to check it out if interested in reading more about the exact findings. But speaking along the same lines and thinking about, as laboratory directors, we often find ourselves working in silos in the lab. And I look back and think of my career and my interest in working with clinical colleagues and collaborating. Can you talk about the importance of collaborating with clinical colleagues and how that's impacted your career and your laboratory?
Absolutely. The lab, as you know, is generally considered a service industry. We're there to really help our clinical partners in each of the different disciplines and departments and provide them with the tests they need to make the diagnosis, prognosis, and management of their patients. And so through my career, clinical collaborations play a key role, particularly in the area of novel test development, helping us determine what is that next generation of testing that needs to be done. At Mayo Clinic, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with several clinical departments from neurology, transplant, and even pharmacy, because a lot of the things I do has to do around therapeutic drugs and therapeutic drug monitoring. And so Aaron Barretto in pharmacy and some of my other contacts, will come up and they'll be like, one of the areas of challenging or patient management is around of our ICU patients. Many of them extremely critically ill, sick, have a lot of parameters that make therapeutic drug monitoring potentially very useful because it's hard, especially when you talk about things like antibiotics. And so Aaron actually approached me recently to do some beta-lactam monitoring. And this is a case where this class of medication, it's one of the most widely used class of medications and antibiotics, yet therapeutic drug monitoring, it really isn't recommended. So if you actually look at the package inserts from the drug companies, there's nothing saying to do therapeutic drug monitoring. And in fact, there's no really FDA approved, nor a lot of laboratories even offering testing for beta-lactams. But because we knew we had a critically patient population, and with this class of drugs, resistance is something that we're very concerned about. So you have to make sure the concentrations are high enough to kill off that organism, but not high enough that they're having side effects and adverse drug reactions to that drug. So there's a delicate balance. And in patients like our critical patients in the ICU, it's hard to judge, well, what is the right dose that they need? Because we know we need to kill off the organism but not cause toxicity. And so the concept is could the lab help develop a test for beta-lactams? And we're like, absolutely. We have the capability to develop a test for things like meropenem. And so we actually conducted a study. And so the lab validated a test. We worked with our clinical colleagues and collaborated on a study in both our adult and pediatric patients in the ICU, where we actually showed, in the case of our adults, right, a lot of times we were underdosing our adults, and in our pediatric patients, we may have also been overdosing or underdosing them. And so having therapeutic drug monitoring gave you an objective way to actually monitor, am I achieving sort of that concentration above the MIC? Because that's the goal in this therapy, is you have to have 100% of the time, the concentration has to be above the MIC, the minimum inhibitory concentration, to kill off that organism. And so with our study, we were able to show that we were effectively under or over managing our patients without it. But with TDM, we could get them to the exact concentration we needed, kill off the organism, and minimize the toxicity. And so it really was this clinical collaboration that now led to a routine standard test that we offer in my lab. And that's the type of thing that I love, is when we have those clinical collaborations, you find that novel test, that new diagnostic marker, or in this case, a therapeutic drug monitoring test that improves the patient care and the results for our patients.
And I love that example, because thinking about some of the challenges I faced early on is any new test development, anything we're working on for the clinical team may often require resources like equipment or staff to do that. I'm wondering, how much of that do you engage the clinical team with? Like for the tests that you've offered now routinely, are they involved as part of that business plan, or are you automatically, like as the lab, submitting these requests for new instruments and then you do what you want with it, as often may be happening at the different places? I'm curious about like their involvement in that process as well.
Very early on, when I first started practicing, and this was back in 2002 to give you an idea of my age, I learned that when I'm going to go in front of my CFO and ask, in that the case, for $500,000 from LC tandem mass spec back then, I went with the chair of my transplant on my side, because that clinical endorsement, at the time, he wanted to bring up drug testing for a drug called sirolimus, which is an immunosuppressant drug that they were using in kidney transplant patients. And there wasn't an FDA-approved test for it. The only way to do it was by LC tandem mass spec. But that's a big capital investment. And I knew if I were to go by myself, I would likely get the answer of no. And this is where that clinical collaboration, working with our clinical partners, in this case, transplant, presented that this is an area where our team was growing. They saw the increase in the number of kidney transplant they were going to do. This was a medication that was shown in clinical trials where we did the work there, that it was proven to be a very effective drug, but they needed to do TDM. They needed to measure it and adjust the levels in these patients to have long-term, life-term immunosuppression, so they didn't reject the solid organ they just were transplanted, this life-giving organism. So with the help of my clinical partner, in this case, the chair of transplant, we went before the CFO, who may have said no just to me, but with my clinical partner, I was very successful. We were able to get the instrument, demonstrate a positive ROI, and improve patient care. So from that lesson very early on in my career, I now, with all my capital equipment requests, make sure I have clinical colleagues and partners who can be there to distribute that message. Because a lot of times, truthfully, it's the clinical messaging that it means more than the lab just asking for something for me. Because I'm not asking for a new toy, even though my Lamborghini, it's the cost the same price as a Lamborghini. And I joke around saying I have all these expensive Lamborghinis. All of these instruments are just tools that the lab can offer a very valuable clinical test for our patients. And so absolutely, I highly recommend anytime for capital equipment purchases, for resources like even people, who are the number one thing in the lab, even more important than instruments. And I'm very fortunate to work with a great group of people, is I have my clinical colleagues support or endorse that request, saying, yes, this service is absolutely necessary for my daily business, to see patients, to expand my practice, and for the future success of this institution. That's the type of messaging that makes me more successful to get the funding.
That is excellent advice. But I do have to say, it would be awesome if you can get a mass spec in red color or yellow color like a Lamborghini.
I agree.
So switching here to a little bit, your volunteer role as president-elect for ADLM, how do you see these volunteer leadership opportunities impacting your career, and how important are they?
One of the things that I always give advice to new fellows and residents who rotate through with us is I learned very early on in my career that volunteer leadership is probably one of the most important things you can do to further advance your career for personal growth and professional growth. My recommendation is to always, first of all, start with choosing an organization that you can champion or get behind. Choose something you're passionate about. And so in this case, the Association for Diagnostics and Laboratory Medicine, formerly AACC, I'm like, well, I'm a laboratorian. This is the organization for laboratory professionals. I want to go and help advance and grow this profession. I believe passionately in what we do, and the work that we bring supports our clinicians and provides better access and patient care for our patients. And so having opportunities to get involved, and for me, very early on in my career, I didn't know people. I stumbled into laboratory medicine. I actually thought I was going to be a pharmacist when I started going to college. But I really fell in love with laboratory medicine. And at the time, it was AACC, the local section, the Chicago section, that took me in under their wings. And in that organization, I had my first leadership opportunity. I was encouraged by my mentor, Dr. Stephen Wong and Dr. Stan Lowe, to join the Chicago section and actually run for secretary. And eventually I became chair of the local section and started my first volunteer leadership within a professional society and organization. And that was some of the most rewarding experience, because I was meeting at that time who were my heroes. So the people in my section, I'm like, these are the same people who authored the TEATS textbook chapter that I just read and was trained on. And some of these were actually past presidents of the organization. And here they're all talking to me and welcoming me into this organization and giving me advice. And you started building up networking. And that professional networking has carried on throughout my life, where I've extended many friendships and colleagues who've opened up new doors for jobs, who've opened up opportunities for research collaboration. This has led to additional publications, studies, and advancing the field. It's this type of unexpected things that you learn, along with traditional leadership skills, right? Because in these positions, you still have to lead and organize things. And so you learn a whole new set of skills that professionally help you advance your career. This led me from starting in the local section to scientific divisions, where I was active in numerous divisions, from the therapeutic and drug monitoring and toxicology division to point of care division to the management science division to the molecular division, and then ultimately led up to the national office, where I got to serve on 2 terms as the board of directors, and now currently sit as the president-elect of ADLM. So these things are absolutely vital. And at the same time, you get the personal growth and rewarding feeling of advancing the profession, the something that I'm passionate about, contributing back to my field, educating others, and giving back. And that piece is just as rewarding as everything else. So volunteer leadership is absolutely something that I think everybody should do, because I think we need more volunteer leaders, truthfully. It only helps advance our field even better.
And I love that you mentioned kind of passion and doing what you love, because I know one of your passion projects at ADLM was Family Feud. And for those of you who don't know, Paul, essentially, I mean, would you mind describing how that came about?
Yeah, so I got to give credit to Dr. Stan Lowe, who was chairing AMOC at the time, and had approached me for a crazy, wacky idea he had. He's like, we're trying to think of something different on a Wednesday evening to do where we could have some science, but also make it fun. And he's like, for the way I taught my residents was I used games. I had Wheel of Fortune, I had Jeopardy. And in this case, he's like, what about that Family Feud style game you had? He's like, do you think we could do that with 2 teams? And so he gave me a creative license to put together the inaugural edition of Laboratory Feud, because we couldn't violate copyright. And we got the board of directors and our cycle leadership to come as our initial 2 panelists. And what started out as just a one-time event has now led to a tradition, which Joe has carried on, because I haven't been able to always host all of them. But it's something that now is sort of incorporated into the annual Laboratory Feud on Wednesday in the showroom, in the expo floor. That was additional draw. And I found that over the years, not only are our attendees enjoying it, but also our vendors. And so it brings people together, has some science, and it has some fun. And that's really what it was all about.
No, it's truly a joy to watch, having attended many of these. And I'm excited to see this continue. And I don't know, will they let you do that as president-elect next year?
I will not be doing it these next 2 years, as I will be awful busy with my other responsibilities.
Absolutely.
But I do see it coming again in my future.
No, that's awesome. Well, Paul, thank you for taking the time today to discuss this with us and for sharing your perspective. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.